building our capacity for cultural humility in cross-racial spaces. This is our 4th session. The first one is just our disclaimer, just letting you know that this presentation was prepared for INTAC under an agreement with SAMHSA, and that all material that appears in this presentation must not be used without permission. That's just common courtesy, right? That if you want to use any of the information on the slides, that you would get permission to do that, and that you would give Resilient Futures credit for quotes and things that you share from that information. Also, this event is supported financially by SAMHSA, as well as the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Just quickly introduce our phenomenal facilitators, Dr. Ellie and Dr. Laura.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Gia, and thank you all for the hearts and love. We can go to the next slide. So our key learning points for today is we really want to dig into some ways to promote institutional accountability as that 3rd tenet of cultural humility. And specifically, we're going to focus on promoting microaffirmations and exploring policies and practices from an equity lens.
And we have gone over these agreements before, so I will just remind us to honor the space. That means, again, maintaining the confidentiality, particularly of what's shared in your Diatic practice that you'll do later today, really honoring what people share in that space and committing to maintaining that confidentiality. Again, we're going to have positive intent and acknowledge impact. If there is something that happens that causes harm, we will acknowledge that. Again, we're going to be fully present, so that invitation to turn on your cameras, certainly when you go into a breakout room, turn your cameras on. And again, just really pay attention to what you need so that you can bring your authentic self to the space. Again, we always recognize that what we say matters, and just we're going to use language that's inclusive, that expands our thinking, and that honors everyone in this collective space. And then that final reminder that trauma-informed work does mean that sometimes we bring discussions about trauma into this space. And so we're just going to recognize that those can be triggering and do whatever you need to take care of yourself.
You've seen these before as well, our shared agreements that are specific to equity work. Really making space for the varying levels of knowledge and understanding that we all have. And so again, today you may find yourself learning something for the very first time or hearing something you've heard many times before. And we just know that that's what happens in our spaces like this. Remembering that our personal experiences really influence how we internalize information. So we might hear the same information and take it in a really different way. And the rest, I think are covered in that previous slide, and that we've been talking about. And just want to remind ourselves, even today in this 4th session, to expect and accept non-closure. That even as we wrap things up, that there is more work to do, particularly in the lens of cultural humility with lifelong learning and critical self-reflection.
So today we are going to do our connection circle in small groups rather than answer in the chat. And we actually have 2 options. One is on the screen here. So if you had a chance, we had 2 homework assignments, and one was to read the article about microaffirmation strategies. And then the second homework assignment was to take 1 or more of those IAT tests. So if you were able to get to the reading, and I'll walk through what these strategies are briefly to help you. But we had 3 microaffirmation strategies that were provided. And the first was active listening. And that's really just focusing on hearing really clearly what was being shared, right, by someone else. And you demonstrate that active listening through eye contact. That's why we always say, turn on your camera so we can see you. Through eye contact, through body posture that's open and welcoming. You might practice active listening by summarizing what I heard you say was, statements like that, but really ensuring that you intentionally understand others. That's active listening. The second microaffirmation strategy that was introduced was recognizing and validating experiences that folks are having. And that means really teasing out the what, the why, and the how of someone's experience. So asking more questions to get more information, really looking deeply into identifying and also validating what someone is sharing with you or behaviors that you're seeing. So for example, student might engage in a certain behavior because maybe they're frustrated and they're showing that frustration, and you're validating, I understand that that's a frustrating experience. Tell me more about that. So you're really trying to understand what might be happening there. But again, you're showing through your words and your actions and the way that you listen that what has happened matters. And so it's a valid experience. And the third part of microaffirmation strategies is affirming those emotional reactions. So that's acknowledging verbally through words that someone has experienced something maybe exciting or frustrating or harmful, whatever it might be. But by doing that, we enable a conversation we let people really focus on those feelings so that they can move toward actions that allow them to heal and be empowered and that foster learning. So those were the microaffirmation strategies that you read. And so if you've done the reading or if that summary was enough, in the connection circle, we're just going to ask you to describe a situation where you might be able to use one of those strategies. So something that happened in the past, you could have used one of those, but maybe you didn't in that moment to promote greater equity. And we want you to consider how might the outcome of the situation change had you used one of those strategies. So again, a time that you didn't use a microaffirmation strategy, but the situation could have been different if you did. The second option, if that you didn't get a chance to read and that quick introduction wasn't quite enough, but you did take an IAT test, the second option is simply to share what came up for you as you were taking that IAT test. So what feelings did you have? What awareness, what thoughts, what came up for you? So those are the two options for our connection circle. And we're going to go into groups of 5 for 15 minutes.
So before we get into microaffirmations, we want to go back to last week's session around resolving racially stressful situations. And we watched the video by Howard Stevenson, and he walked us through these steps to help us, really enable us in being able to access our capacity, including capacity to utilize microaffirmations in racially stressful moments. And so we want to give you an opportunity to look back at this as we move into microaffirmations. And so I'm just going to remind you of the steps here. The first is calculate. On a scale of 1 to 10, where is my stress level? And so I'm thinking about a situation recently, and I think my stress level was probably around a 6. And when I think about locating that next step, where in my body was I feeling the stress? I was feeling it in my shoulders. I could actually feel my shoulders rising up in the moment. I was feeling it in my stomach, and I noticed that my heart started to beat faster. And communicate, what was I saying to myself in that moment? I was trying to say to myself, the sort of automatic messages coming up are like, oh no, what are you going to do in this situation? What if you say the wrong thing? But the messages I was able to kind of slow down and give myself through breathing and exhaling was take a deep breath, listen to what's being said. And that's what really helped me move through that situation.
So we are going to have you practice something called Diatic Listening. And the way that that's going to work is that you will be just with another partner in dyad, so one other person, and you are going to share the response to this prompt. But we're going to be really careful that you're going to listen. We'll give you each the same amount of time, so about 3 minutes each. And the first person who will share will just think about a time that they were in that race-related stressful situation, and they're just going to walk through what was your stress level? Where did you feel it? What were you saying to yourself at the time? And then share that with your partner. And your partner might, in this case, help you identify a little bit more of like, tell me more about what you were feeling. If maybe you say, here's my stress level, I'm not sure, they might help you to understand and unpack, well, was there anywhere in your body that you noticed that sensation? So you'll talk for 3 minutes with your partner, just kind of helping you think through these aspects. And then we'll switch and we'll give you a notification after 3 minutes to switch and have the person who hasn't shared walk through in the same way. But your partner is going to help you identify, if you aren't able to, how these steps in this process. So where your stress level was, where you're feeling it, and what were you saying to yourself, or what were you communicating to yourself at the time? Thank you so much for sharing your experience. And it really does illustrate those micro invalidations that happen, that discrimination that comes from bias. And also I appreciate you sharing the cost of the work that you do. And I think that's something that we often forget. Like the cost of, for folks of color doing this work is profound. So having to go to work and experiencing even in those places, these microaggressions and this discrimination, and that weighs heavily on the minds and bodies and spirits of folks of color. And I just appreciate you bringing that into this space as well. And we're going to, again, be thinking about experiences like yours as we lean into how do we interrupt these things when they happen, and how do we interrupt them on behalf of someone else when those things occur. We're going to go back to our slides, and Laura's going to walk us through some relational trust pieces.
You know, we've been naming a lot of the ways that this work is individual, right? Looking at our own processes, how we can, keep ourselves in spaces where we're better able to respond to racial stress. And we're also, though, needing to look at the relational trust, right? The whatever organization or group or committee, whatever you're part of that's doing this work, also really needs to be looking at these different pieces of relational trust between us as a group, right? So that we can foster safety and have the kinds of discussions that we want to when we're looking at institutional accountability. So we really like this chart from Elena Aguilar's work from Onward, Cultivating Emotional Resilience in Educators. And she talks about these 4 different areas that you can really look at assessing as a group to see where are we with our relational trust with one another. So first being respect, and some questions to maybe ask ourselves to look at as a team would be, do we genuinely listen to one another? And really think about that, right? Are there spaces and time where we really are listening to each other? And do we acknowledge one another's dignity and ideas? Do we interact through a lens of compassion and empathy? The second area being personal regard. Do we care about each other? Do we trust that the other person's actions match their language? And are we falling short in those areas? The next is competence and core responsibilities. And this goes a long way in relational trust. Do I believe in the other person's ability and willingness to fulfill their responsibilities effectively? And personal integrity. Is the other person doing their own equity work? So that self-reflection and lifelong learning needs to be happening for all individuals on the team. Does the other person actively engage in disrupting individual and systemic racism and oppression? Do I trust the other person to use a lens of cultural humility, not to make assumptions and listen to the unique stories of others? So there's a lot of pieces here, and you see again and again, right, how the individual and the interpersonal interact to really create a space of relational trust, so that this work around enhancing microaffirmations, disrupting microaggressions, and again, as we get into like policies and procedures as well, can really happen. And a question, what if the answers to these are no? Well, I think that's, that is probably, there are probably going to be some of these where the answer is no, right? And so this is a place where if this is an assessment that maybe you take a look at or maybe want to bring to your team, where you can start having these conversations and look at them, as related to the goals that your team may have or may want to bring up as a team.
And just to respond to that question too, if the answer is no, the other part of the work is, where else can you have this kind of relational trust? So are there a few people on your team that you can lean into for this trust, so that you're not working in isolation? So really thinking about where are my sources of support around me? And that's going to be really, really important, that everyone has people that they can know that the answer is yes in these areas, even if it's not immediately, like your office mate may not be that person, but is there someone else within your organization or in your greater community, or a mentor or something that you can have to help support these pieces? what if the answer is no? But if the answer is yes, what does racial equity really look like in an organization? In an ideal world, the answer to those questions would be yes. What it really looks like is that all staff members are actively engaged in activities that are affirming and promote their sense of self-worth from a racial and ethnic standpoint. So that's something that happens in all across your organization, whether it's a school, an early childhood agency, a mental health agency, any of the organizations that you're a part of, that is something for all staff members. It also means, and I'm thinking about Jessica's situation, it means that opportunities are provided for staff to recognize and speak out against racial discrimination that they are absorbing in their social and cultural environments. So are there places that someone, even if when something like that happens, are there places that folks can say, hey, wait a minute, there is some discrimination happening. And if it's not happening here, is it happening in our communities? Is there racial discrimination happening in the community or neighborhood, for example, that we work in? There is an early childhood agency that we've been working with for quite some time, and they recently moved into a new building. And one of the things that came up was that their staff of color were having community members kind of making comments and saying things, some negative comments and racial slurs as people were entering the building. And the organization made space to start talking and addressing what was happening, because that was something, as their employees were going to work, they were experiencing some harassment based on where this office was located. So it's paying attention to those things. It also means that staff are intentional in taking on issues of race and racism, which means that they are actively addressing implicit bias. They're addressing microaggressions. So they're not ignoring these things, but they're not just saying, yeah, that happens, that's unfortunate, but they're leaning into what can we do actively to make a difference.
So an organization engaging in racial equity work is going to interrupt microaggressions. And so we want to just first kind of name what those are and how they happen, knowing that we have a lot of you know this information, and we want to review it, make sure we're talking about the same thing. So racial microaggressions are brief and commonplace daily. Micro doesn't mean small, right? Micro means daily, repetitive, over and over again, kinds of verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults toward people of color. So a few pieces there, right? These are things that happen all the time. They're intentional or unintentional. It doesn't make it not a microaggression if you didn't mean it that way. It's still a microaggression if it's communicating those hostile, derogatory, or negative, racial slights and insults towards people of color. And it might be something said directly to someone or something said in passing that folks overhear. And I should say said or done.
What are called micro intervention strategies. And these are strategies that let us actually interrupt and address microaggressions. One of the things we often hear is, I wanted to do something and I didn't know what to do, right? And part of that is related to the stress. That's why Dr. Stevenson's strategy is so helpful to navigate that stress. But if we don't have tools, it's still really hard to know what to do. And so we won't go through the whole thing, but there are a couple of big strategies that happen. And one of those is making the invisible visible, right? So if thinking about a microaggression as something that, it's brief and it's commonplace and it happens all the time. And part of how we interrupt it is like naming when it happens. So the first column, and I'm moving into this first column here of the 3 columns, so there's strategies that you can do specifically for directly responding to the perpetrator of those microaggressions. So someone, perpetrates a microaggression. You can undermine that communication. So you need to recognize what's the meta communication that is happening first. So there's what's said, and it might be a statement, as Jessica was sharing, around language. Or language ability or English proficiency. And the statement, the meta communication is that, English speaking folks are If that is your native language, that is better, which we know it's not, right? Versus being bilingual actually shows a far greater language capacity. And there's also a microaggression around ability and intelligence and experience, that there's a meta communication that happens. And so it's naming, making that explicit. And so an example would be naming, when you say that, whatever it was, you're implying that whatever it is, and that's not true. And so really being specific about making whatever that is, so it doesn't live in the shadows. You're just blatantly putting it out there that this is what you're saying, this is what you're communicating, and it's not correct. So you're challenging that stereotype. You could also ask for clarification. Help me understand what I think I heard you say, Laura, is that, whatever it is. And it sounds to me like you're implying that whatever it is. And by doing that, you're teasing out and you're putting that person who's perpetuated that microaggression in a place that you're naming that it was not okay. And you're also actually educating them if that wasn't the intent of what they meant, right? But you're naming the harm and why it's harmful. Another strategy is to really disarm that microaggression and really expressing disagreement. I disagree, and this is why. So you're stating values or setting limits. In this space, it is not acceptable for you to discriminate against a person based on their language. That is not what we do here. So you're really disarming it. It might be also using describing what is happening. So I think about my own children when they were very young. They witnessed a microaggression with me, and I turned to them and said, this is what I'm talking about when I taught you about microaggressions. This is why. And I said it in front of the person, the perpetrator, and I named it as a microaggression. Going back to that name it to tame it that we often hear and we use with very young children, it's the same here. So naming what is happening. And even if the offender doesn't change their behavior, by naming that a microaggression occurred, particularly for folks of color, we are mitigating that experience of internalizing that racial harm that has happened to us because we're naming it for what it is. So you can interrupt or redirect. Sometimes people simply use an exclamation like ouch or something like that, a way to name what happened. The third column here is educating an offender. So you can, in particular, the part I like here is the differentiate between intent versus impact. There is a difference because a lot of folks say, well, I didn't mean anything by it. Well, even if your intent was not to cause harm, you caused harm, and this is how. And being really clear about that and trying to promote some empathy. Another aspect of educating the offender might be pointing out to that person how they're benefiting from maintaining that microaggression, maintaining that stereotype or that bias. What do they get from that, right? They're putting themselves in a place of power or privilege and naming that. When you use this, when you say that, you're benefiting because you're, putting yourself in a place of privilege over other people in our office, whatever it might be. And that's not acceptable. So again, we're being really explicit. And then there's some things that making it visible isn't going to be helpful. It's maybe you can't disarm it. Maybe education is you're feeling like I can't educate this person, but I need more resources. And is it Guinevere? Is that how you say your name? You mentioned talking to your other colleagues. That's a way of getting more resources and more support. So that might be something maybe you're going to alert here. In this case, it's authorities, but you might be alerting other people, leveraging support. You might seek a buddy system. So finding someone else to work with you to address a situation. You might also, I know I have been in situations where I have absolutely experienced microaggressions and felt racially harmed. And then I seek support from other people in my own network, other folks of color that can help support and build my capacity so that I can better withstand these really difficult experiences. But you're leveraging other support. You have this document to work through. We don't have time to go through all of these examples, but we really wanted to give you at least a tool or resource to know that there are ways, and it takes practice. So the more you practice, the more you will get comfortable utilizing strategies like this.
Just that this can be a great thing to review with your team and come up with some shared language. It can be hard to name these things in the moment, and it can be really helpful to talk about them ahead of time. And knowing that microaggressions are going to happen, how do we as a team want to address them, and what's maybe some shared language that we can use? I think that can be really helpful. So as you're starting to see, I think if you're working through the resolving racially stressful situations with the recast tool, and then you have some of these tools around disrupting microaggressions, then you can also develop these practices around really enhancing your use of microaffirmations, right? These things that substitute the messages about deficit and exclusion with messages of excellence and openness and opportunity, and really messages of connection and messages that you matter. So these are things that we read in that article that we've reviewed now already in the beginning, and in the connection circle around active listening, around recognizing and validating experiences, and really affirming emotional reactions. And I'm not going to go over them too much more right now because we talked about them at the beginning, but they are these messages that can really turn into tangible actions, right? That can be applied to challenging and difficult experiences, that really emphasize the importance of whoever it is that you're talking to and connecting with in that moment.
So we want to take a minute to really think about also, what does this look like directly with children in early childhood education? And one of the critical pieces around really promoting anti-racism in early childhood is to actually give children opportunities to talk about race. We often as adults, we struggle with these conversations. And sometimes we struggle because we maybe didn't have opportunities early in life to talk about things like race. So for example, when I visit early childhood communities, children often read me in lots of different ways, and they aren't sure what my race is. And for example, a lot of kids will say, "Oh, are you from Mexico?" And rather than take that and be like, "No, I'm not," and kind of feel, well, they're talking about race and they're misidentifying my race and being upset about it, it's a great opportunity to engage in conversations that open a child up and normalize it's okay to ask questions like that. And so I typically say, when kids ask things like that of me, I'll say, "No, I'm not. Did you think tell me more why you thought I was from Mexico. I'm actually, my dad is Black and my mom's Brazilian. And I know I have brown skin and dark hair, but, tell me more." And it opens up all kinds of questions and a conversation about their our physical appearance, and have questions and wonder. And it's not meant to be offensive if a child asks those kinds of questions. And so just creating space to normalize that people come from lots of different areas. And it's just that, it's a question that kids ask in the same way they ask about the hearing aids that I wear. It's no different for a 3 or 4-year-old to ask those kinds of questions. Another example is those curriculum materials. It's a great place to engage and have content that talk about race and that celebrate racial differences, and share stories that even about people who face challenges because of racism. And there's that great children's book about Ruby Bridges. That it's a great childhood text, and these texts also are facing a lot of pushback. Right? There's a lot of concern about, well, if we bring in stories like that talk about challenges, we are somehow creating fear in children or making children uncomfortable because of children who are white might be uncomfortable about their racial identity. But there are some really amazing texts that just open up the opportunity to name that people have different experiences, and that our racial identities and our struggles, and also our resiliency that's grounded in our race, are equally important. So it's being really intentional, both about the texts that we have, and the dolls and the celebrations that we have, that we're again really embracing that diversity and creating a context that children feel that every child is a value add to the community, and an integral part of that community.
So everything that Ellie was just talking about really plays into culture and climate at your organization, your school, wherever it is that you're interacting with these young children. And so they are feeling culture and climate from the moment they step into the space, right? So we want to take a minute to just define what those two pieces really mean. Culture is really how we behave. This is the shared pattern of beliefs and values, norms and practices and assumptions that are held by the organization, right? The members of the school community, the organizational community. It's kind of like the persona of a community, whereas climate is really how we feel. So this is the quality of the organizational environment that is experienced by community members, the perception of safety, for example. And it's shaped and cultivated by the culture we create. So we're all experiencing both of these, and we're all part of shaping these things, particularly us as the adults in the school or organizational environment.
So we're going to give you about 5 minutes to either journal if you're someone that appreciates journaling, or just think about this question. Given that definition that Laura shared, so culture being how we behave, climate like how we feel, what is the culture and climate of the early childhood communities that you are currently a part of?
Well, culture and climate can be really essential pieces to think about. Sometimes can feel kind of nebulous, especially when you're first maybe new to an organization. So what we want to also look at is what are some of the other places we might look to start understanding where culture and climate are happening, where there may be issues of racial equity to address. And so some of these things would be just, first of all, looking at policies and practices. And that just starts with the question, where would you find them, right? Is there a handbook? Are there documents in place? How would you find them to be able to start to get familiar with them and really start to look at them with this lens of cultural humility? Who wrote the policies and practices? Who were they there for? Who do they benefit? Who are the people making the decisions in this community? And in what ways do stakeholders have a voice? It may very well be that our policies and practices are really outdated, and that there may be time and space to having some changes made, whether that's specific policies and practices, or just a sort of overview, an organizational look at what's in place here. And then really looking at what does your culture and climate and discipline data reveal about equity in your school or organizational community. And so this can be looking at staff or student surveys, family surveys. It can be looking at numbers of kids who've been disciplined or discipline referrals. It can look at numbers around teachers or staff members who's making those referrals. And another piece to really think about here is who has access to this data, right? If it's something you can find easily, who else can find it? And if it's something you can't find, who else can't find it, right? And starting to really look at how do we do the self-reflection, not just at the individual level, but the institutional level, to show that we're reflecting and working on making changes where they're needed.
So some of the places to begin this work of institutional accountability, and I didn't realize this was animated, so I'm just going to ask you to, Eve, if you can click through. One of the first places is to invest in that critical professional development. And it might be a few more. Yep, perfect. So you want to really gain that professional development. Workshops like this are really helpful. You also want to do the work of examining the role and impact of whiteness. As we talked earlier in earlier sessions, we can't really understand and look at privilege and dominance that's associated with our white racial identity without actually acknowledging that whiteness is a racial identity, and really creating that culture that we're going to understand that. We're going to recognize and name white privilege. So really looking at those societal benefits that occur for people who identify as white and what that means. It means we're actively engaging in that first tenet of cultural humility, which is that critical self-reflection. Um, as we've talked about in earlier sessions, we have to examine how does individual racism manifest in our community? So individual meaning racism that happens for an individual versus a system. Looking at is part of our culture one of blaming victims? So do we kind of racially gaslight people and say, oh, that wasn't a racist experience. You're just overreacting. Is that something that's happening? Is there a blaming of people who are targets of oppression within an organization? It also means, as Laura's talking about, what are those agency-wide data that is giving us information or policies or procedures for institutional racism? So what are those that are helping us understand and really mitigate and root out sources of institutional racism that may be occurring? Because often those are really covert, and it means really looking at those policies to notice, oh, this is in place and it's perpetuating those experiences of racism. And maybe we weren't aware of it, but as soon as we're aware of it, we need to do something to change that. So what are those covert things that are happening? It means looking at curriculum, for example, and looking at how not just are there representations of people of color in curriculum, but what is the quality of those representations? So if there are representations that show stereotype examples, that's not helpful, right? Centralizing perspective. So where are the voices of the students and families and staff of color? How are we doing that? How are we, are there spaces that support Black, Indigenous, and people of color to heal from internalized racism? Are we looking at that? Are we creating those healing justice aspects in the work? Are there spaces, not just for adults in the community, for staff to talk about discrimination, but are there places for children and families? So these are the things that you work towards. And I see it, this comment, like it sounds great, but it's very hard to do in reality. And I would say, yes, that's true. And I would also say that Laura and I have had the ability to work with communities that have, over a course of 3 or 4 years, really started to do these things. So it's not going to happen overnight, but it is a process that it absolutely can happen, that you can create and cultivate communities that are actively doing this work. So this isn't meant to be like a pie in the sky. You're never going to get there. One piece at a time, but it is possible to see these changes in a community.
Yeah, so we want to give you a chance just to think about, where do you want to start, right? What might you take back to your community about bias, which we've talked about in the previous sessions, about interrupting microaggressions, or the intersectionality of racial stress and trauma? What are some things that might be different for you moving forward? And what will you focus on within your organization or early childhood community?
So as we close, we're going to invite you to, there's been a lot, we've had you do a lot of reflection and thinking. We're going to have you just drop in the chat box. What is needed? That's a big question. So what is one thing that's needed to promote institutional accountability for the communities you are part of? So that third tenet of cultural humility, institutional accountability, what's one thing that is needed to promote institutional accountability for the community that you are a part of? So acknowledgement from the top, a willingness to disrupt that status quo, or that comfort, right? Sit in discomfort. And we really thank you for being here and doing this work and engaging with us.
So we want to say thank you again to Dr. Ellie and Dr. Laura. Just want to thank everyone again for taking time out of your schedules. And it's just so good to have you all. SAMHSA's mission, again, is to reduce the impact of substance abuse and mental health on America's communities. And so we want to thank you for your time. Thank you to our facilitators again. And we hope to see you all soon. So thank you all, and have an amazing week, and continue to fight the good fight.